It's very difficult to develop an organizational culture that is quite different from the culture, the broader culture, national or regional or whatever, cultural context in which it is situated. I think the missing dimension was understanding better the local culture. So it gave me an opportunity really to reflect about the role of culture in the development process.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're listening to us. Welcome to Footprints. My name is Jacqueline Asimwe and I am your host. Today I am delighted to share a conversation with my guest, and he will tell us his name and take us way back when. What is your earliest memory?
Okay, so my name is John De Coninck, otherwise known as Mukiibi, since we are in Uganda. My earliest memory is a very strange one. It is remembering my mother draining some spinach into a small, very small sink on a boat. Now, why was that? What was she doing on a boat, and what was I doing on a boat? I was almost born on a boat. My father was an actor in Belgium. That takes us back to 1950. He was running a floating theater. So this theater was on a barge, and that barge would go up and down the rivers of Belgium and France, and would stop for a few days at different towns, and they would perform for the people around those towns. And everybody lived on that boat. So there were two boats, they were tied together. One was the actual theater, and the other one was living quarters. The living quarters were very cramped, and that's why I remember my mother draining this spinach into this tiny, tiny sink, because that is all that was available.
Oh my goodness.
But what I also remember of that time is moving up and down the rivers. I had a cot, and sometimes I was put on the roof of the boat, and I remember vaguely sort of going up and down these rivers. And maybe that is what gave me the seed to travel quite a bit and to eventually make a home so far from where I was born, and to settle in Uganda. I don't know how many thousands of miles that is from Belgium, but it's a long way.
It is a long way. So what was school like? Did you ever want to become an actor, or that didn't cross your mind?
No, it didn't cross my mind. What was school like? Well, the very first years at school was spent in what was then the Belgian Congo. That's when I was first few years at primary school. And again, my father was doing something unusual for the colonial periods that time. And he was running, this time not a floating theater, but a traveling theater. So we were based in Lubumbashi, the second town in the Congo. And he would go around the different parts of the country and perform, not as an actor that time, but as a sort of producer. And he had a local troupe of young Congolese who would perform. And I lived in that kind of environment. So it was an environment that was quite unusual for the white colonialists of the time. It was a liberal environment. It was a free-thinking environment. My mother was a writer, so I came from a sort of artistic background, although I never became an actor. And if I became a writer, I didn't become a very good writer.
But you have written a lot. And I hope we get to that part of your story as well. So what did you want to be as a child, and what did you become?
I can't remember exactly what my earlier interests were in terms of future profession, but I remember around the age of 16, being kept as all children of that age. You ask, okay, what do you want to become in future?
Yes.
And having to concoct stories.
What you wanted to become.
Yes, to meet the expectations of whoever was asking the question.
I thought I was the only one who went through that, but yes, I understand what you mean.
So I concocted something that I felt would be useful, which was economics.
Mm-hmm.
I then, it takes me back to university days. I went to university first in England, and I was in this really privileged university environment, which it was a university that privileged Asian and African studies. Mm-hmm. So somehow there was a connection with my youth in the Congo, and I was put into this environment of having student colleagues from across the world, but particularly from Asia and from Africa, and we were studying the economics of African and Asian countries. The rest of my academic life has been to run away from economics as fast as I could, because the way we were taught economics did not make much sense. Mm-hmm. But I did pursue African studies for some time. Mm-hmm. And eventually that is what brought me to Uganda.
I was just going to say, so what tugged your heart? What made you come?
Well, if I have to be truthful, Uganda at that time was a place where there were openings for young, inexperienced, naive men and women, because Amin had come into power, and I bumped into a professor who was looking for a teaching assistant, and he was based here in Uganda. He was of South African origin. And he was working at Makerere. And he was saying, well, I'm looking for a teaching assistant, and not many people want to come to Uganda, because Amin by then had carved this reputation of not being a very easy or very friendly person. Mm-hmm. So my parents were aghast. What are you going to go do in Uganda at this time? This is a dangerous place. Still, I stuck to my guns and decided to come to Uganda. Mm-hmm. So that was in 1973. The Asians had just been expelled. I took the plane, and what I remember vividly, this was a plane that was coming from Belgium. It was called, at that time, it was Sabina Airlines. And they would fly from Brussels to Entebbe, then on to Nairobi, and then back to Brussels. And we landed in Entebbe, and I was sitting at the back of the plane. And so I got up, and I was the only person getting up at that point to get out of the plane. And the other passengers were saying, hey, no, this is not the stop, wait, because they were all tourists going to Nairobi. And nobody was coming to Uganda because of the very poor reputation it had acquired by then. So I was the only one to get out. And I remember this defining moment where I felt, okay, either I go back to my seat with my tail between my legs and say, okay, well, I've decided actually I'm not that brave and I'm going to continue to Nairobi and then eventually back to Brussels, or I get out. And I guess that was one of the most important decisions in my entire life, because I decided to come out. Mm-hmm. At that time, there was a bus. It was the middle of the night. I was the only one coming out at the old airport at that time. There was a bus, East African Airways bus, that took me to Makerere in the middle of the night. Wow. I still see all these banana plantations again along the Entebbe-Kampala road, which have all gone now. And being seriously worried. I thought I'd made really a bad mistake. But I came and I stayed.
So how long were you a teaching assistant?
2 years. Mm-hmm. 2.5 years, something like that. I was actually instantly promoted, not in title, but in terms of responsibilities, because I enjoyed the job. I was teaching a course on the politics and the administration and the political economy of East Africa. And at that time, at the university, you had large populations of people from Tanzania and from Kenya. So there was this real diversity of people. And, I was very young, so I made friends with students who were my age. So I had a very interesting time, and I was starting also research for an eventual PhD. Yes, Makerere was a really different environment from what it is now. Mm-hmm. Just imagine I think now there are about 50,000 students at Makerere. At that time there was 3,000. And that was the only university in the country. So that was 3,000 for the whole country, which meant that actually it was quite an elitist place. It had, students were really pampered. And when they graduated, they had an automatic job in the civil service. It was also elitist because to some extent, at least at the beginning, it was insulated from what was happening outside in the country. Mm-hmm. It was like a little island of privileged people who were even given pocket money by the state, though they used to call the
boom. Yes.
And it was relatively peaceful, although after some time, people started getting very worried. Foreigners left, and Amin was a frequent visitor, and that what made me to understand who Amin was.
A frequent visitor to the university?
To the university.
Oh, interesting.
So I remember one day that he came to brief us on the state of the war in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. So that was the Yom Kippur War in 1973, 74, I can't remember. We were all told, staff and students, to assemble in the main hall. And I remember Amin eventually arrived, and he walked down the aisle, and he had these two big pistols on his side. And he walked down to the front, and you could feel the hostility in the atmosphere. Mm. People, at that time his English was very poor. Mm-hmm. And the students, because they were in such a privileged environment, they felt, who is this incompetent, uneducated person? But what was so interesting is that it took him not more than 5 or 10 minutes to turn the whole atmosphere around. And he was actually a fantastic orator. He was, as I say, his English was very poor, but the way in which he communicated was so easy, so engaging, that at the end of his 1 hour, people were clapping.
Wow.
Well, that was very interesting. He had in some ways a very sort of, he had a dual personality. Mm. On the one hand, he was the big daddy. One day I had a short conversation with him, and he said, well, I hope that everything is all right for you here, that you're enjoying life in Uganda. I said, yes, sir. And by the way, if any day you have any problem, you just ring me. My number is Entebbe 121. And so he was really the big daddy. But at the same time, you knew about all the terrible things that were happening in those days. So those were some of my impressions, my first couple of years in Uganda. But most importantly, that is also the way in which I met my wife, who became my companion for the next 40 years or so, who was one of my students. So as this young lecturer, teaching assistant, I was doing what you were not supposed to do, and we developed a relationship with one of your students.
Yes. Did you experience the rest of Uganda, and what was that like for you?
Yes, I did. My first ventures outside this little island was going down to Wandegere. That is the time when I remember going to the supermarket and looking for sugar. And I asked around, and people were sort of smiling and laughing at me and said, well, no, there's no sugar. I said, what do you mean there's no sugar? No, there's no sugar. So we were starting to experience the day of shortages and therefore the days of Magendo. So it took me a while to understand that you had to create special contacts and networks and so on, and eventually a bottle of beer would appear from under the bed of somebody or a kilo of sugar. So that was my first experience of outside campus. Another interesting experience, which again is about Amin. I remember one day walking out of the main gate and I saw a few people watching something that was happening on the road. And what had happened is that somebody had a puncture. Mm-hmm. I remember still this little Volkswagen Beetle parked just on the side of the road. And this man was struggling with changing his tire. And then suddenly a jeep stopped, a military jeep stopped, and it was Amin. And he got out of his jeep and started helping the man to change his tire. And that again clicked. That is how this man is establishing a relationship with his people that the previous president would never have been able to. So very interesting contrasts. So eventually I started venturing further afield because I registered for a PhD and I was doing research on artisanal enterprises in Uganda. So I selected some few areas for my fieldwork, and one of them was in Kabale, another one was near Soroti, a place called Otoboy, another one was in Jinja, a fourth one was in Kampala. So I used to go to these various places. I had a small car, which I'd bought by the salary we were getting at university was like a pittance. By that time, the Uganda shilling was pretty much worthless. Mm-hmm. So I had very little money.
Yes.
And I needed to buy a car. And eventually I found a way of doing that. I would buy postage stamps, big sheets of postage stamps, hundreds of them.
Yes.
And the postage stamps at that time were still part of the East African community. Mm-hmm. So you'd buy those postage stamps in Uganda and Uganda shillings. Then I would smuggle them to Kenya, sell them in Kenya shillings, bring back the Kenya shillings and exchange into Uganda shillings. Yes. The Kenya shillings was so much more valuable than the Uganda shillings. So that is how I survived.
And so you were able to buy a little car.
So I was able to buy a little car, and I did my research. I traveled the roads of Uganda at that time. They were very deserted, completely different from what you see now. Mm-hmm. If somebody had told you one day that there would be a traffic jam in Kampala, people would have laughed at you because Kampala was just a small village. Wow. You'd go from Makerere to the center of town, and you'd cross Bad Valley, and Bad Valley there was nothing except for big trees and bats. Mm. Yeah.
Wow, that's
amazing. So that took me around the country and a way to understand a little bit more what was the reality of ordinary people's lives rather than the rarefied universe of Makerere. Because I stayed with local people, or I stayed sometimes in government hostels that was still existing. There were no hotels of that, so you stay wherever you could. And interviewing people about their means of livelihood, because these small, you call them now the Juakali sector. That's what I was doing my research about.
Yes. Mind-blowing even just to think of a Uganda then and what our ancestors would think of the Uganda or Kampala now.
Yes.
Yeah. And so did you stay long in teaching or did you venture beyond that?
No, I stayed for some years in teaching. At Makerere, I met a very interesting man. He was a Sudanese. He was teaching religious studies. We became friends, and he had a project, and that was to start a university in Juba, in South Sudan. His idea was that this was the time of for those people who might remember this, the time of the Addis Ababa Agreement. The Addis Ababa Agreement was, I think, 1972, 73, around that time, 75, I can't quite remember, when they were the first agreement of coexistence between the Sudan as we know it now and Southern Sudan as one entity. And one idea to cement this kind of unity and agreement was to create a university in Juba. Juba at that time was a small village. It seemed like a crazy idea to have a university where there's no electricity, no infrastructure, whatever. But this man had an interesting idea. He said, well, what we need is to create a very practical kind of university where people will be taught not about the theories that you are taught at Cambridge or Oxford, but something that is much closer to the realities of Africa and Southern Sudan and what can be done to better a lot of people. So he said, would you be interested in joining? And it sounded very interesting, and I said, yes, I would join. So with my wife, we went to Juba. She became the radio speaker on Juba radio in English. And I joined as a lecturer in economics. And I designed a curriculum that was very practical. It was 2 or 3 interesting years at Juba University. It was this fledgling institution. It had just started. But eventually it was engulfed by the politics of Sudan at that time. And there was a lot of contention right at the beginning. In practical ways, first of all, because the university accommodated quite a number of students from northern Sudan who were Muslims and wanted to have Friday off, where the people from southern Sudan, who were mostly Christian or other religions, said, no, we want to study on Fridays, we'll take the Sunday off. So there was the university then closed for several months, there were riots and so on and so forth. But the question was that at the beginning, it had never been made very clear whether this was a university for Southern Sudan or a university in Southern Sudan. As far as the Northerners were concerned, it was just like any other university in the country, which was then the entire Sudan. Whereas the Southerners felt, no, this is our university and we have a right to it and we're going to run it the way we want. Eventually it closed for a long time, and there were many difficulties with the administration, lots of conflicts, and eventually I just left. So that takes us to 1980, when I left, went back to Europe for a few months until I was asked whether I would be interested in working for an international NGO. Where? In Kampala. I jumped on it and arrived here in 1979, arrived here at the time of the Saba War.
Yes.
So that was another completely new experience.
Yes.
There was something about Uganda in Amin's time was the repression was quite predictable. Mm-hmm. You knew what you could do, what you could not do. You knew what took you to dangerous zones. But anyhow, coming back to Uganda at the time of the 80, 81, 82, it was a very tense time, and the country was falling apart. Yeah. Eventually, you had one faction controlling a particular part of Kampala, another faction controlling another. Then eventually Museveni launched his rebellion. So I was working for an organization called Accord, which was an international NGO. And I was their first sort of person here. We were working at the beginning mostly in Acholi, which was fairly quiet, but it was a desperately poor part of the country. So it got me involved in community development work. And eventually I stayed until I was deported. I was deported from Uganda.
What is that experience like?
Oh, it was a terrible experience. Mm-hmm. You had these guys, with, even at that time, they were clearly visible. They were young guys. They wore platform shoes and dark glasses and jeans. Mm-hmm. So they came to my office in Kampala. They said, you have to come with me or with us. They took me with my passport, and the man in the passport office said, well, no, this must be a mistake. So he rang several people. He said, no, this is not a mistake. Your visa is revoked, and you have 3 days or 2 days to get out. At that time, I was very friendly with the Prime Minister because he came from Gulu. He was called Otema Alimadi. So I rang Otema Alimadi and I said, Prime Minister, I don't know what's happening, but I've been given 2 days to get out. And he said, oh, well, this must be a mistake. Let me sort it out. I'll get back to you in half an hour. He didn't. After a few hours, I rang him again and he said, well, I'm afraid there's nothing I can do. So I thought, right, this is the end of the road. I better get out. And I was a bit surprised because I couldn't understand what had happened. Now, it so happened that my wife was related to the strong man of the day. And that was Paulo Muanga. It was actually a nasty piece of work. He'd heard that I'd been very critical of this regime. There were all kinds of terrible things going on.
So were you writing? Were you going on radio shows? Were you giving interviews?
No. There were no radio talk shows at that time, but that was for a later generation.
Yes.
No, amazingly enough, it was at a private occasion where one of his daughters was present, and she relayed this to her father. He got very angry. He felt it was like a personal affront, yes. So we were back in England, and I knew that if I was going to come back to Uganda at any point soon, I would have some mysterious car crash, on the road from the airport. Even though, at that time, the organization for which I worked received a letter of apology, and we were told officially it was a question of mistaken identity, but I knew very well that it wasn't. So that was a few years in England. We had our children then. They were born in England. And
but you just leave. You put your clothes in a suitcase.
That's right, and that's it.
Hand your keys or just leave the house and go.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I came back and the Museveni government took over. And that's when I continued with my work in the civil society sector. And I did some little consultancy work here and there. Worked for a while for an outfit called the Overseas Development Institute in the UK. And eventually settled more here. And it was at a time when the NGOs, CBOs were burgeoning. It was a very interesting time. There was a lot of enthusiasm, optimism, and also interest from foreign donors to invest in the country. All that led to NGOs springing all over the place, very fast. People of very good disposition, very much oriented towards dealing with issues of social justice and access to basic services and so on, but with very limited competence to run organizations. And that led me to think about an organization that would be also an NGO, but a non-operational one. And that, I think, the first of its kind.
What does that mean?
And it was called the Community Development Resource Network. Quite a mouthful. That was one of our earlier mistakes. Anyhow, CDRN, as it became known, developed as a tool for the NGO and the CBO sector, a capacity building tool, helping organizations to develop, to understand their context a bit better, to be a bit more strategic in their thinking. And it obviously met a demand because it started developing, became quite a large organization. At one point it had about 30, 40 employees. And it was run in a very participatory way. It was at a time when there was an approach called PRA, Participatory Rural Réseau, was being experimented with. So we did a lot of PRA training in various parts of the country. We also did organizational development training. And we also developed a research angle. So we started writing monographs about civil society in Uganda from different perspectives. It was a very interesting period. I stayed there at the head of this organization for about 8 years and then passed it on to a new person. I felt it was important to create something that was a bit sustainable. So a new team took over and continued with what we felt was very important, was to have an organizational culture that allowed people to have a real say in how they would run the organization. It was done in all kinds of different mechanisms, but it was run essentially by the staff.
What do you mean by that? Can you give us an example?
They were, for instance, the supreme, other than the board, the supreme decision-making body of this organization was the staff meeting. So the staff meeting would meet once a month and actually decide on the policies of the organizations, on what we should do, new ideas, and so on and so forth. As the organization grew, it developed a decentralized way of organizing itself, what became known as chapatis. So the chapatis would include a team working on a particular area. So there was a research team, there was an NGO support team, there was a CBO support team, and there was an administrative team. So that lasted for a few years. Unfortunately, the person who took over from me passed on. I think she found it quite difficult to make sure that the organization kept being relevant, and eventually it died. But one of the main learning points from my time was that it's very difficult to develop an organizational culture that is quite different from the culture, the broader culture, national or regional or whatever, cultural context in which it is situated. So it gave me an opportunity really to reflect about the role of culture in the development process. Much as PRA was very interesting because it put the community at the center of its development aspirations, there was very little said about culture. And yet, increasingly, it became evident that people would take part in all these PRA exercises very willingly because they are great fun. But they would say, okay, now we've done the exercise, thanks very much. And then they would go back to whatever they were doing before. So there was no real buy-in. I think the missing dimension was understanding better the local culture. So having left CDRN, I got together with my good friend Emily Drani, and we started talking about the cultural dimension of development. And at that time, the discourse on this was very negative. For instance, it was the time of the HIV and AIDS epidemic. One of the main explanations for this epidemic here in our country was it's due to culture. It's due to the behavior of people, and that's why the virus spreads so quickly. So move away from your culture. And if you, by the way, if you want to develop the country, if you want to be modern, leave your culture.
Or adopt another.
Or adopt another. Yes. So our starting point was, let's look at this from a different perspective and say, even in terms of the AIDS crisis, what positive aspects of culture can we identify and can we research to better understand the context, the cultural context? Now, for instance, I don't know, I don't remember the statistics, but there were millions of orphans at one point. And if you'd been in a Western European country, all these orphans would have been accommodated in orphanages, terrible places. What happened here is that families would take over orphans. And indeed, the same thing happened with myself and my wife. We were surrounded by people who were dying, and we adopted 3 girls from one of my sisters in law. So why is it then that this whole fantastic cultural resource was not being talked about? That this great burden was actually taken up by the culture of people, was to say, no, we can't leave these children just alone.
Yes.
We have to incorporate them. And not incorporate them in any kind of way, but incorporate them in our families. Fantastic strength. So we started saying, well, right, can we be a bit more organized in this? And we started developing some case studies about culture in development in relation to different sectors. Like the importance of local languages, the importance of herbal medicine, the importance of cultural ways to govern ourselves, even culture and gender, which was very, very difficult field. And we set up this organization called the Cross-Cultural Foundation of Uganda. Again, quite a mouthful, but cross-cultural, why? Because this was the time when ethnic identity was seen as problematic in our country. The problem is that we have all these ethnicities and they don't get on together. Yeah. And indeed, cultural identity was being manipulated by politicians.
Yes. To divide.
And to rule. So as part of our main message, we said, no, let's look at this as a fantastic opportunity and a richness. You know, what would Uganda be like if we were all Luos, or we were all Bachiga, or we were all Bamasaba? Let's look at this as a great source of strength and resilience and potential for the future. And the foundation, because at the beginning we thought it would be a foundation to give out grants for people who are doing work in this field. That was very optimistic and a bit naive because we never raised any money as a foundation, but we were pushed in doing things ourselves. So we started building an organization that was dedicated to promoting culture in development. So we started training courses for people who are interested in this approach to look at culture as a useful element of the development process. We also discovered community museums, and we got some funding to support community museums in different places. And we also started working very much with the youth. With the youth, we started what we called heritage clubs in secondary schools.
Yes.
So we developed a toolkit, and teachers were trained, and young people who had started feeling quite divorced from their cultural roots were given this opportunity to reconnect by fun activities, like, for instance, talking to your grandparents about where you came from, building up family trees, understanding where different cultural resources existed in your vicinity, inviting clan leaders to come and talk at your school, and things like that. Very simple activities. Now, this met a lot of interest, and as I speak, there are more than 500 schools in the country where they have heritage clubs.
Wow.
The next step was to influence also the Ministry of Education to integrate culture better in the curriculum. It was at the time when the lower secondary school curriculum was being revised, and we had a measure of success there. So now there's more of an appreciation now of the role and the importance of culture in secondary schools. But then these young people would come and finish S6, and some of them came back to us and said, well, now what?
Yes.
You know, where can we go?
Yes.
So we were fortunate, and we got some support from UNESCO to encourage 4 universities to start a Bachelor of Arts in Heritage Studies, Cultural Heritage Studies. As we speak now, the first students are coming out with a BA in Cultural Heritage, and hopefully this will last for some time and will change a little bit the perspective that people have on culture. It's an ongoing work, because the context is changing so fast. We now have young children who are totally anglicized and are taken back to their Chialo and during their holidays and can't converse with their grandparents because they no longer have even their local language.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more work to do with that.
Yeah.
But the work at CCFU has been very interesting and very rewarding to me. I felt in a small way that I was contributing to a fight against neocolonialism. Why? Because, and this is very controversial, when the British came, they actually came, it was a very sort of light structure. They were well armed, there were very few people, but they managed to dominate the country very quickly. But they came with missionaries. And these are the people who decampaigned, as we say in Ugandan English, local cultures from the beginning. They've had, to me, the missionary societies here have had the most negative, the most abhorrent influence on the country. And it's a lasting influence. As I say, this is very controversial.
Absolutely. And we will end this segment here and we'll come back for part 2 and listen to more of John's story. Our listeners, thank you for listening and join us again next week when we bring you part 2.